Thank you everyone for joining. This happens to be the last time we meet in this course called Creative Writing in Practice. We are at the end of the semester, and I'm very happy that we are going to go out with a bang, as they say. And the final talk is a special lecture, a conversation with Shubhangi Swarup, an author in conversation that will be conducted by Dr. Arunima Bhattacharya. And I'm very glad to have both of them here who have made time from their busy schedule and very gracefully agreed to do this. Thank you for everyone who's joining from inside and outside the course. Let me say a couple of things about the course before I introduce them and give the floor over to them. We'll have a conversation for around 45-50 minutes, and then there'll be room for all of you to ask questions. So this is at the end of the semester, and so far what we have done in this course is to talk about the craft of creative writing, talking about poetry, prose, especially the idea of a transition from short story to novel. How is it that one writes a novel? How does one work on a sustained long narrative, especially the long form of it? And the craft of creative writing is what we've focused on rather than theories. We have talked about theater. In fact, I see Rahul here who did a wonderful guest lecture on theater. Being a theater practitioner. So we've kind of gone through the major types of creative text, so to speak, and discussed genres and, plot, character, hook, how to mix genres, how to experiment with fiction and kind of discursivity in fiction, how to work with ideas that may or may not always have a narrative premise and weave them into a narrative structure, let's say. So with that, as a little bit of an attempt to situate the conversation we're going to have, let me introduce our author today and then the interlocutor. Shubhangi Swarup is an Indian author, journalist, and educator. She holds a Master's of Sciences degree in Violence, Conflict, and Development from SWAS University of London. She's best known for her novel, Latitudes of Longing. That is the novel we'll be discussing today, which was published in 2018 by HarperCollins and was declared a bestseller soon after its release in India and Sweden. Swarup has worked as a journalist since 2008 and has written for Open, The Mint, and also worked briefly in Zanzibar in 2011. She was the executive editor for LSBR Channel, India's first virtual reality journalism platform, co-created by filmmaker and producer Anand Gandhi. In this capacity, she directed and wrote When Borders Move, a documentary about Handaman, a village in Kargil that once belonged to Pakistan, was shortly in no man's land and now belongs to India. As part of the Dexer, I'm sorry about the pronunciation, and Friends dance project, Swarup was part of Fire of Anatolia, a Turkish dance group consisting of 120 dancers, several choreographers, and other technical staff. Additionally, she has volunteered as a teacher for street children and low-income groups and co-founded the community group Hamara Footpath, a Mumbai-based NGO dedicated to the educational needs of children who live on Mumbai streets. As you can see, this is a diverse and esoteric career, and I'm very happy to have her here. I can share a link to her Wikipedia page that has more details about her work. Dr. Arunima Bhattacharya, who has kindly agreed to be the interlocutor, is a lecturer in English at Edinburgh Napier University. Her research interests include colonial urban cultures, early 20th century travel literature, and island ecologies. Arunima has an active interest in museums and the heritage sector, particularly with community participation and co-creation. She's currently a co-lead in an AHRC-funded project titled White Thinking and the Failed Promise of Diversity in Scottish Heritage, jointly run by Edinburgh Napier University and the University of Strathclyde. Her most recent published work includes a journal article titled Beyond the Developmental Narrative of Postcolonial Nation Time, The Materialities of Water and Geological Fault Lines in Shubhangi Swarup's Latitudes of Longing in Postcolonial Texts. So no wonder why we have her here. And a co-edited special issue titled Between the Field and the Gallery, Exploring Anthropological Knowledge in South Asia in the journal South Asia, Journal of South Asian Studies, again in 2024. She has co-edited a volume titled Literary Capitals in the Long 19th Century, Spaces Beyond the Centers, Palgrave 2022. So I'm very happy to have both of you here. Without further ado, I'll give the floor over to both of you for the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Arko, for that elaborate introduction.
Yes, thank you so much for making this opportunity for me. I had actually contacted Shubhangi just so that you know why I'm gushing or why I'm here. I had contacted Shubhangi when I read her book over the pandemic, actually, and it was a strange time, I think, for all of us. So it stayed with me, and eventually I did happen to write that paper that Orko just mentioned. So that's kind of my engagement. You can see how I feel about the book in that paper.
And I remember Arunima and her talking about her father,
who is a geologist. Yes.
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 Yeah.
Thank you, Shubhangi, for agreeing. Thank you, Orko, for organizing this. I have talked to Shubhangi prior to this talk, and we have kind of set a few questions that we want to talk along, along the lines of. But of course, it depends upon the conversation we are having today, and it might, get to different places. So of course, all of you listening can, pick up on whatever I have left off and ask her questions that you think I might have skipped. So given the context of the course that Orko mentioned, and I have had a talk with him about this as well, we'll start with a very basic question about, how, Shubhangi, you came about writing this novel. Why the novel particularly? Why not poetry or some other genre and form? And if you could tell us a bit about your early career and why you got into writing and how.
So as I was telling Arunima, I got into writing after a series of, I think, disillusionments with various fields. When I was in college, I was quite an activist in my extracurricular space. So I thought that studying human rights would be a good way forward. I studied it. I started working in the field with international organizations, and I got swiftly disenchanted by the amount we had to hold back. Ironically, you need to have a very hard heart to work in that field. So I switched to journalism, which I found a little more freeing. But even nonfiction and research has its limitations. And I realized that I was actually just yearning to write fiction, probably. When I slipped into it, it really felt like I was coming home, and I didn't know what home was till I reached there. So that has been my long journey. And as Orko has mentioned, I have also worked as a sidekick in a dance troupe. I have done utterly ridiculous things in life. And, luckily I'm in a profession where everything comes together. And the more time taken is the richer the narrative. So I have no complaints.
So when we, talked last time, I remember that you mentioned that with literature, one has to stay with one's vulnerability, and that becomes your strength. I really like that. So I was thinking, because a lot of the people on the course are probably aspiring writers, and they are also writing as part of the course, which is maybe a bit different in terms of being evaluated for it. But if you could just talk a bit more about that, because, any form of writing, even academic writing, is quite difficult. So I was wondering how you would.
I guess, for me, writing was liberating also because I never studied it, what shall I say, academically. I was never judged for it. So it was this passion, it was this pure space for me. And it was a space where I never sold my soul. I could sell my soul in any other field, but this space was just me and the page. So like I say, when I write, my vulnerability is my strength. Being a young woman at the time that I started writing, the people I looked up to, the kind of novels I liked, Mr. Amitav Ghosh, of course, is one of them. And he went to Myanmar, he went to Egypt, he went to so many places. And so many of the other writings I enjoy personally were the ones which involved, mystery, intrigue. I don't want to say travel, but a diversity of experiences. And I realized that when I wanted to do the same, there was this kind of unspoken backlash that, it's not safe to do this, write about what you know. which stay within your comfort zone because you will be safe in it. As a young woman, we would advise that to people, which would have meant that I write about Bombay and I write about the middle class in Bombay, probably. But that's not what interested me. And now, as time has gone, I realize that's an easy way to control, especially women in our society, when we make them believe that this is for your own benefit. But actually, it's not. It is society, or it is our environment's job to actually keep us safe at all times, and not just in my room. So when I decided, so I had this, what I thought at that point, this beautiful idea of using a tectonically active fault line to connect all the stories in my novel. Because since I have not studied plot, I don't really understand what the big importance of having this plot is. So I thought, let's use something from nature, because I connect with nature. Mountains and seas or oceans speak to me as much as human beings.
Mm.
So, when I decided to go and live in these places and work in these places and research in these places, I was also putting myself in a vulnerable position, in a possibly dangerous position. I taught as a school teacher in Ladakh at the line of control, which actually wasn't one of the most dangerous things. I was also in Andamans, I was also in Nepal, in Myanmar. So, over time, my vulnerability became my strength. Literally, there are so many limitations. I could only work from sunrise to sunset because I was alone. My companions were, like I said, insects, geckos, crabs, earthworms, and they became a part of my story. And I very often say, if I was a 6-foot man, I would have written a very different novel, which would have focused more probably on politics and, the dictators and the failed dreams of a nation. But in this case, my vulnerability has become my strength, because it opened me up to other vulnerable voices. Even in a village, what shall I say? For me, every human being is like a book. I just don't need to be in a library the whole day. If I have, like, this conversation can also be a source of inspiration, it can be a source of language, and so many things. So, again, one of the good parts of, if you view life like that, is that even an illiterate person or someone, who otherwise we wouldn't view as a repository of knowledge, suddenly becomes very important. And that's what happened. So many of the oral stories have become inspiration for the small stories in my book. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I thought when we talked about it, and even now, when you kind of explained it a bit more about what that process looked like, I will ask you about the research, because a lot of research has gone into this book. But yes, it's good that, I guess that's one of the most striking things about your book. As a woman from India, knowing what the, unofficial curfew time is, it did strike me when I read it, that as to how you moved over these geographies and all of that. Yes. Okay, I'll also try and contextualize this conversation perhaps at the very beginning, now that we are here. In the context in which we are having this, particularly about the power of writing in that sense. So in our conversation before, we talked a bit about the power of stories, right? In connecting philosophy of science with planet and environment in that sense, because that is the kind of the central idea of the book. So can you speak a bit on the reception of climate fiction or nature writing, that if there are existing biases that you encountered or that you thought about when you got into this territory? How do you feel about these labels? Are they convenient silos, or do they help the work travel to the intended audience?
See, as a writer, I'm not concerned with silos. I'm not concerned with genres. I find climate fiction to be a very Western genre. I don't identify with it because I feel like, because I believe my writing doesn't have much to do with climate. In fact, it's indifferent to what we call climate change, because it is trying to work at a much larger narrative, which is the story of the planet, the story of all the species and all life, and the little role human beings play in it. So, human stories are part of the larger story, which includes the sun and the moon. And the truth is that this story will outlive all our stories. That is it. And when I view climate fiction for them, like what did you call it? The doomsday horizon? What is
Oh, the
it?
event horizon, the event
Event
horizon.
horizon. In climate fiction, we treat it like that is the end, when human beings go suddenly blip, everything goes. But honestly, like this is what I'm saying, even if we just use our common sense, we know that can't possibly be true because there are a lot more species and life is much longer. I think our planet is 4.5 billion years old. Life is almost 3 billion years old. So then it doesn't make sense to identify just with human beings. And even at that commonsensical level, since I haven't come to writing from my education. I haven't come to writing from my intellect. So I have used a lot of common sense and just what we call daydreaming, staring out of the window. And anyway, my daughter thinks that that's what I do for a living. I stare out of the window. So just that will also help us reach similar conclusions, that life did not begin and end with us. And all our stories are interrelated. So that is what led to this. So for me, genres can be stifling. As a writer, I must resist it because the idea of genres comes from the same source as the idea of having different courses on science, technology, and literature. I was a victim to that. We had to choose arts and then we couldn't study science.
Yeah.
So later in life, I had to teach myself the earth sciences. And this comes from that worldview. So I feel it's a bit redundant now.
Yes. Believe me, we are also having to teach ourselves other disciplines now that we have to survive in academia. So, yes.
Yeah.
Um, Kind of following up on that question and just kind of also wrapping it up a bit, because now you have also kind of become almost like, you are a public figure and you are getting invited to big literature festivals, also representing the country in some ways. So how do you then see yourself in this tradition of Indian English fiction, like in terms of how other people around you who are also in the same career kind of locate themselves?
I only represent myself. Anything other than that is lofty. And I represent my idea of humanity. It can be very different for someone else. All my only job on this planet is to explore my own idea of life, my humanism, and to work on those grounds. My idea of humanism encourages me to view all other species as part of my life. So to me, living on Mars makes no sense because we can't take a tree with us. And living on planet Earth without the possibility of a whale or a dolphin or even a crab doesn't make sense because it makes me happy. So this is my idea of humanity. It doesn't begin and end with our borders because as I have discovered, the borders in our subcontinent are as old as my father, who was born during independence. The Himalayas are much older. They are 15 million years older. They gave us the monsoons. The Indian Ocean is, I mean, she is a huge mystery for me. So I also like to study these to shape my idea of stories and narratives. And this is all I can represent. I
Mm.
can't claim to even represent my own child. So how can I claim to represent a whole school of literature?
Mm. Yeah, we had a long conversation about this, idea of climate fiction and nature writing, right? And how that has become this one shelf that you see when you enter into bookstores. But how, as your book says, and that's the main conversation we should be having about this interconnectedness of things, and how it's quite absurd to think of this as one of the genres that we are thinking about.
And even gender, because I am a woman, I am my kind of a woman, but someone else's idea of gender and experience of it is different. We have so many things. So I have the most honest answer I've ever reached is I can only represent myself. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a bit of like sort of a gist of the novel, just in case, to help people who have not gone through the novel yet. I'll just read that out because otherwise I'll spiral out and try and talk about everything, which will take up a lot of time. I want to come to one of the basic themes, one of the main themes that I have thought about a lot. And I had in my previous chat with Shubhangi, we had discussed this for quite some time. So I'll leave that to her to talk about. I'll just give you a general idea of the characters and how they move across geographies in the novel. So the novel is set along nodes that occur on a highly volatile fault line that runs through this region of along which the main locales of the narrative are set, making it, and because of the fault line, this region is highly susceptible to earthquakes and tsunamis, but also creates a space for human stories of resilience and forbearance. I'll focus on those stories and then I'll leave the planet and the geology to Shubhangi to talk about. The novel is divided into 4 sections: islands, fault line, valley, and snow desert. In the first section, islands, we meet Girija Prasad and Chanda Devi at the very beginning of the novel, where they're newly married and settling down in his new job in the Andaman Islands as the head of the Indian Forestry Department, setting it up literally. In the second section, Fault Line, we focus on Mary, a woman belonging to the Karen community, a community who had migrated from Burma to the archipelago to work and settle. Mary was engaged as a house help by Chanda Devi, kind of taken in by her family. With Mary, we begin to move into the second location across along the geological fault line, that is Burma or Myanmar. And Mary's story is linked to Plato, her son, who is a political prisoner of the junta, and Thapa, a climate refugee and Plato's friend, a climate refugee from Himalayas, who's also a tradesman. And being a friend of Plato, he takes it upon himself to unite Mary with her son. The third section is more about Thapa himself and Bhagmati, which is her preferred name is Bibo, by the way, Bebo by, Kareena Kapoor Bebo, and a nightclub dancer at Kathmandu with a penchant for stories that she asks Thapa to, kind of come up with. So leading on to the final phase of the novel, placed in the snow desert of Tibet, where the village elder Apo, also a keeper of stories, falls in love with her, a woman who travels to Apo's village with her son from the Kashmir Valley. We also meet Girija Prasad and Chanda Devi's grandson Rana here in the final phase of the novel. In the course of the story, Girija's family moves out from the islands into the mainlands of India with his daughter, and Rana, his grandson, finally finds himself at the army base at the Siachen Glacier in the Himalayas. And in this gist, of kind of locating the characters along the geography, I have focused on the human characters in the novel that kind of drive the story forward in terms of action and time in the narrative. But what is fascinating and truly, the most unimaginable is the unimaginable scope of geological time, counting in millions of years, into the everyday life of the human characters in a way that makes them relevant to their immediate realities. So this is something that I discussed with Shubhangi in our chat, that how and what I find most fascinating about the novel, and something that I would want to ask you and to talk a bit more about, is how did you manage to, sort of make this unimaginable scope of time that Timothy Morton, people like that, call hyperreal, the hyper object, because it can't be imagined in human time. But in the novel, you literally feel the characters living with them. You can see the planets, sort of the materiality of the time in the life of the characters, in their everyday life as they're going about their everyday jobs. And that is fascinating for me. I don't know, that is what I'm still curious about, even after our chat, that how did you manage to do that? What was the strategy around that, the writing strategy?
You mean to say, how did I bring in, like, say, billions of years or a larger understanding of time into it? Well, honestly, so my creative process is to do a lot of drafts, draft upon draft upon draft. I don't, it's almost like adding layers, like how rocks have layers for me. Each draft is a layer of a story upon a story. And while doing that, it's almost like excavation. I discovered other layers, other stories. So even if this is a room, then there, the rocks, the insects, the sun and the moon outside, they all have their own unit of time that they come with. And once these small characters start to play some role, with them comes another appreciation of time. So it wasn't my active intention to, but by being inspired by nature, first of all, nature and the planet work at a different time scale altogether. It's very difficult. I still don't understand geological time. I'll be honest, I keep getting confused between the eons and the epochs and everything. But to me, it's a story. So I remember it as a story. First, this happened, that happened. And in between the dinosaurs and, say human beings, something else happened. So I've been trying to grapple with it. And as a process, you see a lot of it in the book. But I would say, if I could offer some small practical insight into it, the minute you open your story and your writing to other kinds of characters, like say a shell or a cloud or a ghost or an earthworm, you are also inviting other understandings of time with them. Yeah.
Yes.
Or a mountain. Yeah. To really write about a mountain, you need to understand the time, the life of a mountain. Yeah.
Yes. And in terms of, like, I was going to, one of the questions I was going to ask you later on is about the ghosts. Like, and as you mentioned, they're linked to this idea of time in the novel, right? But what about, why do you think, like, and this is about the structure of the novel in some senses as well, as to how we can kind of meet the characters that we meet at the very beginning of the novel, like the ghost of the goat, for example, and Girija in the first section, and we meet them again towards the end. So was this something that you intended, the structure and how the story unfolded, or is it something that, is part of the structure of understanding time?
So, like I was sharing with you, my starting point tends to be playful. You know, when I write firstly to, what shall I say? I can't say entertain myself, but to keep myself fulfilled and occupied. And when I started writing this, first of all, again, common sense leads me to believe that if someone can see the ghost of a human being, why can't we see the ghosts of animals? You know. Then I started thinking about it. And I was like, if we can see the ghost of animals, why can't we see the ghosts of extinct creatures? Then why can't we see the ghosts of elements? And then I realized this is a great device to actually work with deep time, what we call. I can actually bring an extinct ocean. I can bring an extinct continent. I can bring in a lot of layers through just ghosts. And then it got exciting. And that for me is like, modernity is bringing science with creativity. So we are now, we are not just restricted to someone else's idea of ghost, but I can actually really read and find out about maybe how life looked like 10 million years ago and bring it up in another context. So which is why I start with the ghost of a goat, because it automatically also tells the readers this is the kind of novel they're expecting. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So this is something like, should we talk a bit more about deep time in terms of how you understand it, as in like the definition of it for the people who are listening to us? And this is the question for Orko as well. Like, should
Could
we
you
talk more
define
about?
deep time? The teachers in the room, could you all,
Yeah.
define deep time for us?
Uh, should I go ahead, or yeah? So I've kind of looked up, and I thought that maybe we would need to talk a bit about deep time and Anthropocene, and just the general definitions of it. And what we talked about in our chat earlier, and the links I was supposed to send you as well, was more or less around Timothy Morton's concept, who is also a philosopher. And he engages with the concept of deep time, exploring the vastness and the interconnectedness of geological timescales and their implications for human understanding of the present and future. And he emphasizes the need to reconsider our relationship with Earth, recognizing the Earth's long-term processes and the profound impact of human activities on the plane. But one of the things, and you asked me this question earlier, that do I find any of these philosophical understandings of deep time useful, right, when I'm trying to think about this critically? And I felt that some of the writing, some of the critical writing I read about it helped me visualize it, and that helped me understand it better. And, one of the images was that of the sort of nested sort of drawer kind of image, where one epoch or one eon is nested within the other. And that's the kind of way in which time is built, the structure of it. And it was so difficult, as you said, it's so difficult to understand the structure of time visually when one is thinking about deep time, and then think about it on the level of, say, I'm going to get up from here, get my coffee, etc., and how I'm going to plan my day. And then narrative time is so different because we progress from one word to the other, one sentence to the other. So that is also very linear in that sense. You can't skip words and can't skip sentences in that sense. We have to progress in that way. So that's something that I was thinking about when I was reading a book and writing about it. And I don't know if you thought about it. Did the idea of deep time come in at the very beginning, or did it come in through stories of the particular locations? Like, was it there in your very early drafts as the main thing? Or is it something that came up when you tried to talk about the stories of the people and the
I was
incident?
also reading this research done in the US that majority of the STEM students struggle with deep time. So it was trying to build a
Thank
case.
God we're not the only one.
Yeah, I was trying to build a case about how the human brain is not equipped to understand deep time. And that I found very interesting because that for me is a challenge a storyteller can take up, to just work with the narrative of time, probably. Um, I feel like majority of our problems in life stem from not understanding time properly. And by that, I don't mean like coming to school on time or showing up somewhere, but not understanding that everything that lives will die. And, time is much larger than any of this. If we could just accept that, our choices would be very different. But we don't make those choices, right? We live like this is all there is. So for me, time and mortality are linked together. And this is a philosophical or spiritual quest for me to respect that, to see the beauty in that.
Mm.
Uh, we have that beautiful word in Hindi called Kal. Kal means mortality and time both. And, like I say, it didn't come from an intellectual pursuit of when I was writing that, oh, I should mention these things. It was just like actually falling in love or discovering. There are some parts that really inspire us. And for me, this larger appreciation of time comes from that. It makes me feel minuscule, even in my own story, and it makes the human beings feel like ants. In my novel, the human beings are like ants. They are part of the landscape, and they think they are in charge, but there are much greater forces at play. And I find that humbling. I find that also healing to know that, my ego is actually baseless. And even the idea of a story that humans hang on to is
Mm.
kind of baseless. What is a plot? Like sometimes our stories defy all of this. And when I write, I give into that, the failures of writing. Okay, there is no end, there is no beginning. We are doing something, we're writing, We'll give it some structure, but it doesn't follow our demands. Characters don't listen to us. Nothing listens. And this comes from like this leads to a much larger appreciation of time for me. So yeah, it's digressions sometimes. Yeah.
That's very interesting. That's how I imagined you would say this as well, given the kind of chats we have been having. Yes. Now, because you mentioned this, I was also like coming back to something we discussed earlier about the research process that went into the novel. And you have lived in these places and you have, talked to these people, you have enduring relationships with them. If you could tell us a bit more about how that translated, that field experience sort of translated into the novel form, like in the language that you chose to write in, the stories that you thought, the emotions that you wanted to write about, and if there are any particular moments from this time that you would like to share, any difficult ones, any, as you said, healing ones.
In terms of research.
Yes, yes. And
So
also how that translated in the novel itself. Like, of course, the way you felt it, I'm guessing, would be very different from how you wrote about it, because of course it is
yeah.
evolving and all of that. So a bit about that.
Wow. Well, I took 7 years to write the novel, and I took a lot of research trips. I lived for months and months on end in these places, and I was very keen not to be a parachute
Mm,
writer, as we have that term parachute armchair anthropologists, parachute journalists. I didn't want to do that, where I just sort of take some details from a place and situate a story there. I wanted to really feel it from the heart. So I lived in all these places. I have realized that the idea of a story that comes to me initially is always the most trite and, what shall I say, cliched one. When I go to a place and I actually start living, I start opening my eyes to the complexities, the possibilities, the characters come to me. There is one thing, okay, I go with some characters in mind, and that is true. I have like one or two broad-based characters in mind, but the rest of the characters are also surprises. So there is a great scope for surprise, for the story to change. And sometimes we have to be humble enough to also listen to that. Um, since my background is in social sciences, I believe a lot in research and reading academic papers, going to libraries. But that over time, I realized is just one part of it. Then as a journalist, I used to hold the transcriber a lot. Not the transcriber, sorry, the recording device. I would record all my interviews. But after a while, I stopped recording interviews because for fiction, it's important to really be present in the moment and to understand that this moment is all there is while I'm listening to you and talking to you. If it has an impact, it will stay in my heart. And whenever I want, I can remember it. It's not going to come to me by listening again to an interview or reading, the emotion of the moment. I have to pay attention to your body language. I have to be open to my own emotions. So it almost became like a kind of a meditative activity. So then I left the recording device also. Anyway, it's exhausting to go through your own interviews and transcribe it. So I was very happy to do that. And then I realized it's fiction, actually, It's fine. Sometimes people lie, but the lies are more interesting than the truth. So then that also becomes part of it. I bought a lot of regionally published books. I bought a lot of folk tales because I'm interested in the folk tales and creation myths. I just find them really interesting because I have a childlike interest in them. I grew up reading those kind of stories and they still interest me the most. They have magic in them. So that's the kind of things I would also like to work with. And after a while, up from books, it also became people. Like when I started approaching people like books and just paying attention, different stories started coming to me. Like, for example, in Ladakh, I was listening to the village elders and this person who was my host. I was living with him. And then his mother would be in the corner. She would speak a different language. So no, she wasn't part of the conversations. But I was just interested in talking to her. Her son wasn't interested in me talking to her, but I was like, I want to talk to her. Also because I was getting fed up of a particular kind of story coming my way. So I just started talking to her through translation, a translator. And then she said that, there was a time when this land was a no man's land. When India and Pakistan were fighting, it first belonged to Pakistan. We knew that. And then India took over. But no one knew that for around 6 months, no one was there at all. There was no government. The two governments were on mountains fighting, and this was a no man's land. And this piece of information came from that old lady who no one was paying attention to in a conservative village. And her own son said, "Inko kuch nahi pata," and all. And then I was like, but she's saying it, and she's been around at that time. And I started researching. And from the villagers, I realized that such a time existed and the details and everything. So there is a big danger in the way we are taught and the way we are expected to conduct research because it devalues a lot of people. And not just people, it also devalues other life forms. Like, I can also observe an insect and write a whole paragraph on that or get a turning point in my story from that. I may not be able to interview them, but I can get something from a marmot. I have hung out and watched a marmot in Ladakh also. They are very cute creatures. So yeah, or if I feel happy in the company of a dog, so be it. That will also give me some information. It's just about being open to all and other kinds of voices. And like I'm saying, I'm very lucky to be in a field where I'm allowed to do all this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this relationship, like, you know, even while writing about this novel critically, and the last part of it is so much about the word love. But then there is also so much to be said about empathy as the nature of that love. And when I looked into it as a critical concept, it did exist, and it exists in just what you described right now in terms of a way of understanding other life forms around us and the way of connecting with them. So I was wondering if, you know, how would you define this concept of love, the word love that comes towards the end of the novel, as the love of sun and moon, and also the love between creatures, between, you know, the gecko, for example, or seashells that have like become fossils in the snow desert?
You know, firstly, it should be a great relief to know that empathy is not something that can be taught in colleges. So we don't need to
Thank God.
stress out so much. It's about just being present with ourselves, you know, and even love is, what shall I say? I do believe that it is a very powerful force. It is a force of creation also. And I feel for me, love is a form of connection to everyone and everything. And I have experienced depression and sadness and many other things. Sadness, first of all, is not a problem, but depression for
Mm.
long bouts can be. And have real have come to understand is that it is when I'm not connected to my environment, to my surroundings. I'm not connected in relationships. So isolation. For me, the opposite of love is when I feel isolated. And that's not just related to the human world. We can also feel connected in nature. In fact, that is, you know, like I often say, I'm from Bombay. It is not a very natural world out there. We are almost 20 million people now. Our rivers, our nalas, highly polluted. So, if there is someone, I would understand the value of nature and the disconnection I feel, you know. So when I go to a mountain place, or not just that, even when I see an ant, to me it is a very powerful, it's a revelation, you know. There are forms of connections that do make me feel complete and make me feel less lonely, less scared. And then I go chasing it. What is this, you know? That's so different from my life.
Yeah. I was like kind of moving away from the novel for a bit and thinking that now that the novel has been out in the world with people like, and you have, I guess, talked with many people like me who have read the novel and loved it. How do you feel about your relationship to the work now, given that, you know, some time has passed and you have talked about it in different contexts and perhaps received many different kinds of responses to it as well?
You know, I'm extremely lucky that the novel still is growing with time, almost like an individual. I feel like it's my first child. The relationship has only grown with time, and I'm very lucky that readers across languages, it's translated in 17 languages, readers resonate with it, you know, and I feel that resonation comes from the heart. uh, the resonance, sorry, not the resonation, the resonance comes from the heart. And when we open, you know, when we're open to an idea, or we are open to a different way of looking at the world, that to me is the power of fiction. And this book is growing in that direction. So my relationship has only become stronger and stronger, if I may say, with time.
And what about the translations? Do you have any, like, any input based on the language in which it is getting translated, or the kind of feedback that you get perhaps from the translators on what's the process like in
Well,
terms of?
generally they have queries about what exactly do I mean about, you know, a particular word, a particular word, sorry, because each word also has many layers, many meanings.
Mm.
So what is the larger meaning? Then there are a lot of, you know, accuracies, inaccuracies, but that's still at the intellectual level. Uh, Covers, they're always a big, you know, generally the translator and the writer has a, I would say, a healthy relationship. It's when marketing comes, it becomes a bit difficult, because what do they want to market? Do they want to market an idea of India, an idea of me, or an idea of what the book is? And what is the book? You know, sometimes people want to put, like the Italian cover, they put a lady with a ghungat. And that book actually didn't do well. That was the, for me, the most inaccurate cover.
Mm.
And also predictably the book didn't do well. You know, it's when there is nature on the cover, which is what the novel is about, it does much better. So I feel there are levels of honesty and dishonesty. Sometimes even like you're speaking about the genres, even books by the cover and the tone sometimes can be victims of Orientalism. Yeah.
And I'm guessing that given, the fact that you are also from South Asia and writing about nature, it would have, in the international context, a degree of this, what you just mentioned, a degree of tokenism as well. I guess all of us who work on an international context do sometimes get, like identified first as this checkbox person from a particular
Yeah.
place, and then your work is important. So, have you come across anything like that? Is there any way that you
Much.
tackle this?
Yeah, so much. And you know, I'm not indigenous. I'm from Bombay. I'm fairly privileged. So, I mean, but I can still have a relationship with nature. And sometimes people come, you know, जैसे बोलते हैं भूले भटके, you know, they can also come, you know, it's not always like a legacy. From my journey has been through that. So it sometimes I just have to establish that we also have urban spaces in India, and we also have pollution, and we are also, you know, I mean, my city is probably more crowded, urban, and modern than many of the other cities I've visited in other parts of the world. So, yeah, I have to break that notion.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we are close to time now. Will
It's
it
a
be?
24-hour city. You're
Yeah.
living in Edinburgh, I'm sure, but like Mumbai is, you know, way more, what shall I say, urban and like, you know, goes on and on and on. So yeah, I have to break a lot of those stereotypes. But the book breaks the biggest stereotypes. I'm just the carrier, you know, then okay, the remaining I can, you know, break. But book is the biggest vehicle.
I
Yeah.
still adore this cover, this particular one. I don't know if it's blurred out, but if you can make it out. This one,
Thank you.
first one.
It's
Uh,
inspired by shell, the spiral. I have a
yes.
lot of this, an ammonite shell, which
Mm.
is my friend Tenzing Sundu, who's a very big Tibetan activist and poet, gifted me an ammonite shell from the Himachal, which is, these are the sea fossils. You know, there are sea fossils still on Mount Everest that are found because it used to all be a seabed. So for me, things like that really inspire me, information like that. So it's inspired by that fossil that I have.
When I talk to you, I feel like there are so many voices in this novel, of all these people that you described about the old woman from that village in Ladakh and this friend of yours who's somehow present in the cover as well. And
Yes.
they're all there, including the voices of all the non-human things as well. Like this, once you think about it. And that's, I think, one of the things about the book is that you have to reread it. And every time you reread the thing, it's a different experience in some ways. And you're recognizing certain things. And that's why I totally agree with how you described it as a sort of a stratified narrative, almost like a sedimented rock formation in that sense. So yeah, that I resonate with that idea as well. Anything else that you want to, talk about or say that I didn't bring up?
No, not really. Well, I was, you know, asking both of y'all before. I understand that there are students who study science and tech. And I'm so glad, you know, because I feel this binary between nonfiction and fiction is a very damaging kind of categorization. And like I was telling you, whenever I meet corporate people in Bombay, you know, they say, oh, we read a lot of nonfiction. We don't read fiction because it gives us knowledge. And it's a big laughing, you know, like I just have to like, what shall I say? Keep quiet at that moment and help them, you know, like, you know, fiction has the power to change perception. If you are looking for information to improve your CV, sure, go ahead and read nonfiction. But if you view yourselves, you know, like you're doing great disservice to yourself, to the power of change that you carry, if you look at life in this way, you know. Um, if if there is any part of you that dreams of a different possible reality, that dreams of little revolutions and changes, then that is what fiction is about. It allows us to dream without walls. So I would urge the students not to be tormented by this idea of information and only non-fiction carrying information.
Yeah, from the discussion that you had about, the response that you had on research, I felt like it's similar to kind of our research project as well. You try to have all these crutches in place because you're feeling not very confident enough
Yeah,
when you're starting
true.
out. But then it kind of, when you start walking, you don't need those, but it's just a good thing
Absolutely.
to have them. Like it's just a good thing to have that. Okay, I have that in the background. But of course, as you said, the feeling that finally kind of appears on the paper is about what you actually remember about that moment and that book and that idea more than your recorded conversations in that way. Yes, I resonate with that as well. So I'll hand it over to Orko and see what the students have to say. Let's see what the questions are.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, both of you. This is such a wonderful conversation. I was kind of lost in it for a while, a little bit. So I'll just ask maybe two very quick questions before opening it up. They're not really questions as such, but as someone who does creative writing myself, I often kind of have this almost a dream of a novel that doesn't necessarily rest on a story, but rest on its prose, rest on its the internal qualities of prose. And I suppose one of the problems with that is that very often it would then be called a poetic novel, a lyrical novel, and take away from what is prosy about prose, if I may say so. And just to give the students a flavor of your prose, I wanted to read, if I may, the first two paragraphs of this novel, especially for those who haven't read it. And this is, I think, a wonderful example of what I'm talking about, where you don't necessarily need a story, at least not at this point. And I'm reading here from the opening paragraph. Silence on a tropical island is the relentless sound of water. The waves, like the sound of your own breathing, never leave you. For a fortnight now, the gurgle and thunder of clouds has drowned out the waves. Rains drum on the roof and skid over the edge, losing themselves in splashes, simmer, whip, thrum, and slip. The sun is dead, they tell you. Seeded in the sounds is an elemental silence, the quietness of mist and the stillness of ice. There's no story, if you like, if you want to have a very orthodox understanding of story here. But there, I mean, for me, this is also storytelling. It's not just, of course, it's building an ambience and so on, but there is a story in this tension between silence and sound that is described here. There's a story that is told by non-human elements, which sort of brings me to the question I wanted to ask you, Shubhangi, that it is extremely difficult to write non-human stories with all these understandings, which are primarily speculative understandings that we human beings have, as storytelling as a sort of like exclusively human, project. This is how we typically understand it, that human beings are storytelling animals, others don't. And we don't really have a proof in ethology about this, but we go by a certain loose, again, perhaps a very anthropocentric kind of speculation that we are the only storytelling creatures. So as storytelling creatures writing about the so-called non-storytelling elements, how does one write, stories of the non-human? Because of course there are stories. How does one write them? I'm sorry if I'm asking a question that is repetitive in nature, but if you wanted to add something to what you've already said about this.
It's an important question because I do feel that also our education is and our Western education is so responsible for this dilemma stepping in. I'm also a product of that education system, and I had to this idea of the intellect and research and knowledge being something that is can be you know can be proved in an experiment in science and research. These are also just a particular way of understanding the world. There are so many others, right? It was a lot of unraveling for me to accept and, to let my curiosity take the way forward. This idea of consciousness Like that is also, I feel, something which could probably, lend itself to what you have asked, is this idea of, okay, we are the only storytelling. And then who is really conscious? Are the elements conscious? Do they have a life of their own? And does life mean this idea of eyes, nose, intellect, storytelling? All that, these are very deeply philosophical questions. And I feel that fiction frees me from judgments and it just allows me to explore it. So if you had an idea of what a snake feels when they shed skin, you can explore it in fiction in a way that, our research will never allow us to. So for me, fiction is a freeing place. And I feel like these are all things that stem to our childhood. Yeah. We didn't question ourselves so much when we found an animal, or when, you see a dead animal and you cry. You don't ask, but what is this? Is it a storytelling dog? And, did this mouse, what shall I say? How did it experience life? Does the mouse's mother cry or not when she dies? So I feel like it's almost like we have to go back to some inherent qualities we have and not judge ourselves. And definitely, my education system tried very hard to take me away from it. Yeah.
Yeah, so this constant unlearning in some sense.
Yes.
Great.
I really feel there are some truths we feel in our heart. We don't feel it in the mind. And our mind can never take us there also. So even the heart has its own form of intelligence. And this kind of intelligence comes from there. Like to me, an ocean need not be conscious for me to respect the ocean's rights to be, an entity of its own, or to respect its purity, or to view it as a form of life, because it supports so many life forms. But this, my intellect may not take me to.
And also, because you mentioned ego earlier, I feel like this idea of response, the fact that the ocean proves its consciousness to you through speech or through
Yeah.
narrative, in that sense, is part of related to our ego, right? In the sense that
Uh,
you need that response in order to recognize the rights, as you said, of the
exactly.
ocean or any other, like dog or tree or any of that.
We've even created gods in our own likeness, right? That's how big our ego is.
Yeah, and this also resonates a lot with the creative process, because I think a lot of, I mean, this is something we've discussed a lot during the course, that one of the perhaps most interesting things about creative writing is that you can lose yourself there. You don't
Mm.
have to have a very hardwired notion of the self. And even if we do, it's lost in the process of creation,
Hmm.
slowly but surely. And I think that's the uncertainty and the challenge, but also for me at least, the pleasure of it as well, to some extent. That,
Absolutely.
yeah, we
I
don't
think
really
that's the
write.
best gift, right? That's the best gift writing can give us, right? If we lose our boundaries or borders.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
this is a good point, maybe, to see if students have questions. I mean, anyone else, anyone. I say
Sure.
student because it's a course lecture, but I'm aware there might be some external attendees too. If anyone wants to ask a question, I think I've now enabled the video and the audio. So feel free to unmute yourself, speak, put your video up if you want. It's not, of course, compulsory. You can always just have the audio and make the question understandable. You could also write in the chat box. I'm looking at that as we speak. If you have questions, this is the time. Go for it. Yeah, our students could be a bit shy. I know that. Maybe we could take
No
some
problem.
more time in case they want to type their questions in the chat box. I
Yeah.
wanted to ask, again, a very naive question, I suppose. How did you arrive at the title, and when? Was it
Oh,
at a very late stage or earlier?
yeah. Last stage. I
Hmm.
was always calling it fault lines when I wrote it.
Right.
And we had my editor helped me reach this. So it was a term somewhere in the book.
Hmm.
He
Hmm.
picked it up. Yeah. My editor has I have a very good relationship with my editor. I do think he helped, bring some things to the forefront, like the
Hmm.
title. And very silently, what shall I say? He's not impositional, but he helped.
Hmm.
He he helped the book become more of itself. Yeah.
Right, right. And I mean, it's not exactly a question, but just maybe for the benefit of audience, I was also struck by the way, even though you're not, of course, talking about academic research, but your, professional identity as a journalist, your background in social science, ethnographic research has played a role, right? And you
Yeah.
mentioned Amitav Ghosh, who's possibly one of the first writers in late 20th and early 21st century to introduce this idea of a kind of a research novel, so to speak, that novels could also be
Yes,
empowered by research, because
absolutely.
there has been a sort of binary there, research versus the creative, as it were. But that was kind of broken down by the likes of Amitav
Yes,
Ghosh.
absolutely. Research and even science as a form of inspiration,
Hmm.
news as what shall I say, a source of characterization. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
But that,
Another thing that I kind of wanted to ask you is about your own readings of literature and your influences, perhaps beyond the Indian English tradition. Because I mean, of course, feel free to mention other Indian English writers too. Because I'm generally interested in this sort of feedback loop, especially in a country like India, where we have all these bhasha traditions that are, in most cases, older than the Indian
yeah,
English tradition. And then there are Indian English writers, and then there are writers who write in both languages. So I
yeah.
was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what kind of literature you grew up with in terms of your own identity as a reader.
So, I generally like reading books that have been translated. I don't know why. I feel like they have a different quality. Translated from other Indian languages, translated from other foreign languages, right? From Icelandic, Spanish, Japanese, Korean, and I treat it in the same way, Kannada or folk tales. Folk tales also are to an extent, I can say, if not translated, but transcribed in some way.
Mm.
Like I love A.K. Ramanujan's works. Um, so I treat it all as part of the same spectrum. Really, for me, borders make very little sense. So, and I find that when I read works in translation, they introduce me a different way of a different, almost like brain, I do believe that language wires our brain in a particular way, and
Mm.
English has wired my brain, and Hindi is my mother tongue, in a particular way. So translated works introduce me to different ways of looking at the world, and I find that fascinating. Any like any language, I don't even judge, like is it coming from Asia, is it coming from somewhere else? No, because
Yeah.
it's the brain is so, I mean, all languages are so unique.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose in the Indian context, there's always this, bilingual, trilingual, multilingual exposure that we all have, and
Yeah.
most of us would, at least speak two, if not three languages, and also understand a lot of other languages loosely, perhaps. So
Yeah.
translation is a sort of mode of being in a country like India, I suppose, and
Yeah.
that might add to the. So I do see a couple of questions in the chat box. Let me see if I can relay them to you. The first question is from Aniket, who says, I really like the way you mentioned the idea that characters don't listen to us. So, how do you think that in the creative process, there's a sort of struggle with the others, and how do these others contribute to an act of self writing?
The others are very important, I would say. Like, so for me, as a novelist, a character is as important for me as a living person. When I'm inhabiting a character, I'm writing, I'm experiencing all the emotions they are. So I give them the same what shall I say? I give them the same relevance. I have a relationship with my characters. For example, if a character has to die in my book, part of me dies with them, and I go through a process of grieving and moving on. And it is extreme, like I said, it's a very good thing that characters don't listen to us. It's great for the creative ego, because they are showing you that they have a life of their own. They are there on the page, but they are not your puppets. And there is a pushback. If I'm listening, there is always a pushback. And I have faced it literally. Like, I love killing characters, I've realized. I don't know. And I tried to kill at least 2, 3 more characters in my book, but 2 just refused, They just refused. And by refused, I mean it's a very poor paragraph. You can't do it only, like it's just not happening. So it made me wonder then what are they trying to do and what was I trying to do, with this. Like, I feel like these things come from the idea of a plot. Oh, so this person should perform this role in a plot, But sometimes characters don't want to do that. They also want to live their own destiny. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
That's a good thing. It makes a novel come to life.
Right. Yeah, we're talking again about the sort of the loosening of this idea of the author god or whoever has
Yes,
complete
yes.
control over the narrative. What if we do it the other way around, where
And that I feel is like a psychiatric disorder, That's a crazy person. Why do you have to control over everything? That's really, so it's an obsessive compulsive disorder, yeah.
Yeah, we have another question from Arundhati, and I'll take this opportunity to thank her because she has played a role in facilitating this conversation, and I think she is, through one of her friends, kind of reached out to you. So let me take this opportunity to thank her as well. Okay, so her question,
also.
Her question is about the 4 parts. Were they conceived simultaneously or were they separate from each other? She asked, but then you created the connection between the 4 parts. How does it work to connect them? It feels as if creating the earth with islands, mountains, valleys, etc. So that's the question.
So the question is, how did I conceive it as 4 parts and how did I connect them? Now,
and did you conceive them simultaneously or successively, perhaps? That's also in a question.
So for me, the inspiration was, the more I travel or the more I live my life, I feel that there are greater connections than my mind can decipher sometimes. Like, islands are connected to the desert, the mountains are connected to the ocean. And I'm very, what you call, how shall I put it? It's almost like a spiritual thing for me to, try to understand what these connections are, because my brain cannot understand it. My brain is very limited. Deep time is a problem, all these things. But these connections do exist, and geology tells us when Mount Everest has sea fossils on it. Now, there's no way you'd believe that, right? Like, the highest place on earth has actually sea fossils on it. So then I start working backwards. So what are these connections? And can my stories bring that about? Like, my basis for stories is that to explore interconnections. Well, the fault line has so many diverse geographies on it. And since my muse and narrative thread was the fault line, I had to do justice to that. So, literally whatever was on the fault line, it's not for me to decide, is it right or wrong? If it's on the fault line, well, we do have mountains, we do have a snow desert, and we have islands. So it was all there. And I did conceive it as 4 interconnected novellas from the beginning, because I have this belief that stories interact with each other and our lives interact with each other. So it is possible for me to feel happy in someone else's happy ending, even if I'm having a sad day. And it is possible for someone else to be impacted by my life, even if it's just for an hour. And that's how stories and people interact. So it became the idea of a plot or just one story I felt was a little false for me. I wanted to explore my lived experience of stories interacting.
Yeah. And that's another thing that I was really sort of, in a way, struck by in this conversation, that the importance of lived experience, and in a way, perhaps also the importance of staying in a place, and the sensoriality of it, experiencing the place with our own bodies, and how that is different from, let's say, watching a YouTube video about the place, right? And how that sort of lends a different kind of flavor to the writing if we have done that long haul.
It's also about, part of what we talked about before is that the beginning, the couple in the beginning, Girija and Chanda Devi, we are not able to see them through, right? But we meet Apo and Ghazala at the end, and it felt for me, it felt like a resolution because you know that Chandadevi dies. Sorry for the spoiler, but in the end, you see Apo and Ghazala as well, and it's such a liberating kind of love because it doesn't have to do anything, achieve anything or fight for it or something like that. It's a very peaceful sort of resolution at the end. So, as you said, and we talked about this about finding the resolution of one story in another. It doesn't have to be the same people, and it doesn't have to be the same, people getting what they had
Exactly.
started out to
And
achieve.
if we can live with that capacity of happiness, or capacity to relate, then our lives would be so much richer, right? And our stories, if we could relate to so many other things.
Yeah. And about the structure of the novel, I also felt like because Orko also read out the first part of the chapter, and now that I think about, as I said about the rereadings of it, I can see the ghost ocean in the very first line of the novel. And that's how interesting it is about the structure being something that, unravels through many readings and associations with the novel, but also about the general nature of water, how you go from islands into valleys and then finally into the snow desert, whereas ice melts into rivers and then into pools and then the ocean. So the process of the planet in that sense is the reverse of the structure of the novel as well, which I found really fascinating about going back in time in that sense to the glacier from which water emerges in that, or rather the oceans emerge after a point, and etc. So that's also a very fascinating thing about the structure.
Yeah. In
Thank
fact,
you.
it's one of those pleasures of rereading something, right? That when we get those new nuances, very often it's sort of retrospective unfolding. We realize something that is perhaps, ahead of its place as either an intended or an unintended anticipation. And we can only know that from the finale or from something that unfolds much later in the book. But sometimes all of that is resituated when we reread a work, right? So we're running out of time, but I'm wondering if there is another question, if someone wants to unmute themselves. Okay, I see a question from Laila who asks, how was it to travel solo as a woman to remote places during your research? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Okay, right.
It was tough. I won't lie. And sexual harassment has been normalized. At initially I thought that this is the risk I'm taking because I want to write this book. But now, as an older, probably wiser adult, I realize that this is not, what shall I say, this should not be a given. This can change, and we should not what you call we as women have been raised to believe that there's a certain price we pay for our independence and for being out. And I was also raised with that idea, but after Me Too I realized that no, it's not my problem. I should, this is what we should expect from our environment. We should expect a safety net, and sadly with writing and artists we are not given that safety net. I don't know which field we are given that in, but in our field, so definitely not. So it had both sides. It had all of this, but it was also very reassuring. So many parts of mine were healed, because I made new friends. I could trust people. I could trust people with my life in difficult situations. There were places where I didn't have phone network, where even if I asked for help, no one would have reached on time. But I was protected and I was nurtured and I was looked after in those times. I once had an accident and I fell off a cliff, and three people had to pull me up, and they were laborers, and they formed a chain. It was a 10-story cliff, and they pulled me up. So I think I opened myself up to the journeys, and it healed me in many ways. And I'm grateful for that. I didn't let my fears draw my boundaries. Yeah.
Maybe to ask a naive question again, are you planning a second book at this point, or?
Yes.
Okay.
I am working. I just finished the short story. I'm working on a second book. I'm exploring a different language and everything different for it, you know. Because to me, that's the biggest joy. I'm sure you know as a writer, like the
Yeah.
joy of exploring new terrains.
Right. So Prerna has a question. Let me just relay that to you.
Yeah.
She says, 7 years is such a long period to continue writing something with the same dedication. Did you ever want to just stop and go back?
No, that's an important question, because we live in a world where 7 years is considered to be a long time, when it's actually not such a long time.
Yep.
There's a lot of pressure on us to deliver the goods, probably, as quickly as we can. So I did feel a lot of pressure, but I was doing this for myself. First of all, I was an unpublished writer, and I still consider myself the same. What shall I say? I have spent more years in my life as an unpublished struggling writer than I have spent in the opposite. So I still identify with that. I feel like the world is outside, the world is what it is, but I write for myself, and I give myself that space to explore and do what I want to on my own terms. Also, because I'm angry and frustrated with the world telling me to do different, what shall I say, do things on their terms. I disagree with it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is a very important question along perhaps the lines of discussion that we had on geological time. What is 7 years compared to geological time? A large part of our capitalist reality these days is to contract and perhaps, in a way, not just contract time, but also to hurry time or
Yeah.
rush it up in a way that, if one cannot write a book in 7 months, that's a major failure. So that, I think a large part of writing is perhaps also an attempt to resist that sort of
Yeah,
rushed temporality of
I
our
agree.
society these days.
That sense of hurriedness, and the other important thing you touched upon, success and failure. That's a very capitalist notion, no?
Yeah.
Because for me, I feel writing is the biggest joy I give myself. The success comes, what shall I say? The fulfillment of having written is far greater than any other idea of success or failure I'm going to get. I could have written a different novel in 3 years' time, which would have been acceptable by Indian English standards. It wouldn't have deep time, it would have a lot more economics and politics in it, but it would have left me unhappy. And I feel like this is a space where fulfillment can be achieved, and it is important. Individual fulfillment.
Right. I think this is perhaps a good point for us to finish unless we have another question. So, last call to the floor. If you have a question, please unmute or type it out. If there isn't another question, I'd just thank Arundhati and Bikram, who have played their roles. Bikram as the course TA, who has done the logistics and helped us record the session, which will be up on YouTube from I think the IIT Gandhinagar channel.
One more question, sorry, that has come.
Sure, there's another question. Okay.
One last one from
Right, sure. Let's take it, and it's from Bikram, so that's, I just mentioned it. Great. So as you mentioned, I'm going to relay it. As you mentioned that the book is growing with time, and in this process of growing, the book is becoming of its own. What do you think of the book's self-consciousness and its relation with time and the readers?
Well, I do believe that the book is its own being, and I do understand it as a process of birthing, not a process of creation. It's not my own, it's not a creation of my own, but I'm just bringing it into the world by, listening and being, what do you call, diligent to the birthing process. And the book has its own relationship with readers. It has its own relationship with time. It also has its own relationship with the author, you know. Um, and that's beautiful, which is why I feel, if I don't allow the book to be itself, if I don't allow the characters to be themselves, then they will also not allow me to be myself. because I'm introducing a lot of tortured and tormented people into the world. So it's, it's good. We liberate each other by liberating even fiction or something, it's a mutual liberation and it's beautiful. Like I'm witness to that.
Wonderful. On that liberating note, now that I've thanked both Vikram and Arundhati, let me thank Arunima for giving the time for this. And of course, last but not the least, Shubhangi for doing this. It's wonderful to hear writers talk about their work, and especially I really appreciated the freedom and the frankness with which you talked about not just your work, but the way you see the whole process of writing and your relationship with creative writing. Because I feel all writers have some sort of a very complex and very nuanced, but at the same time, a very simple relationship with their work. Simple in the sense that it's complex, but not complicated. Or perhaps it could be complicated too at times. But I think that came out quite beautifully through this conversation. I remember reading this novel first before COVID, and I think I mentioned this to you in the email as well, that it had that weird kind of a timeline in my head that it was one of the last novels I read before COVID, and things changed so much after that that when I reread it more recently, it somehow had that shadow of COVID, which is of course counter chronological because you wrote it in a world before the pandemic, but it really spoke to me in that sort of way as well. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that. But
For me, it was the opposite. For me, in COVID, reading the novel actually helped me think that, this time is very different in comparison to the time that we are also living in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Thank you,
thanks
both
again.
of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Arko, Arunima, Arundhati for putting us in touch.
Thank you, Arundhati, for making this chance for me as well. So thanks.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you both, Arunima and Shubhangi.
Good luck to all the students and anyone who listened, actually, why just students. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.